What if beneath the vast Pacific Ocean lies evidence of humanity's true origin, deliberately hidden from modern memory? What if an entire continent, more ancient than Egypt or Mesopotamia, was systematically erased from our historical record by forces that feared what its discovery might reveal? What if the scattered island cultures of the Pacific are not isolated curiosities, but the last surviving fragments of a civilization that once spanned a landmass larger than Asia? Tonight on Slumber Expeditions, we explore the mystery of Mu, the legendary lost continent of the Pacific, and examine the controversial theory that its existence has been intentionally suppressed throughout history. We will journey through archaeological enigmas scattered across thousands of miles of ocean, investigate ancient texts that speak of a motherland now submerged, and consider the possibility that conventional history has deliberately overlooked evidence that would fundamentally reshape our understanding of human civilization's origins. From megalithic structures on remote islands to linguistic connections that defy geographic isolation, from geological mysteries to persistent oral traditions, we will trace the fragments of what may have been humanity's first great culture and ask why its memory might have been purposefully erased from our collective consciousness. So, before you settle in, if you're finding comfort in these forgotten mysteries, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, but only if you genuinely like what we do here. We would also love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to connect with a global community of curious minds who share this fascination with civilizations lost to time and memory. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's speculative journey together. Let the known world fade away as we venture into the realm of forgotten continents and suppressed history. You're standing in the British Museum's reading room in the spring of 1864, surrounded by clay tablets recently excavated from the ruins of a Mayan temple in the Yucatan Peninsula. The scholar beside you, a French archaeologist named Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg, traces his finger across unusual symbols etched into the ancient surface, his hand trembling slightly with excitement. He has been working for months to decipher what he believes is a Mayan codex, and he is convinced he has finally broken the code. As he translates the text aloud, you hear him speak of a land called Mu, a vast continent in the Pacific Ocean, the original homeland of humanity, destroyed in a single catastrophic night by volcanic eruptions and earthquakes that sent the entire landmass beneath the waves. According to the text, the survivors scattered across the globe, carrying fragments of their advanced knowledge to primitive peoples in Asia, the Americas, and the islands of the Pacific. Brasseur de Bourbourg looks up from the tablet, his eyes reflecting both wonder and confusion, and whispers that if this translation is accurate, everything historians believe about the origins of civilization must be reconsidered. The concept of a lost Pacific continent did not originate with Brasseur de Bourbourg, though his work brought it to widespread attention in the Western world. Indigenous peoples throughout the Pacific had preserved oral traditions for countless generations describing an ancestral homeland, a vast land in the ocean from which their ancestors had come before some great catastrophe forced them to flee to the scattered islands that became their new homes. The Polynesian peoples spoke of Hawaii, a legendary original homeland somewhere in the vast Pacific. The Maori of New Zealand maintained detailed genealogies connecting them to this distant land. Hawaiian oral traditions described a great continent that once existed where now only islands remain. These were not vague myths but specific cultural memories, passed down through specialized knowledge keepers whose role was to preserve history with absolute accuracy across generations. What makes these traditions particularly intriguing is their remarkable consistency across cultures separated by thousands of miles of open ocean and, in many cases, having no known contact with one another for centuries. The Easter Islanders, isolated on one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, preserved legends of a larger homeland to the west. The inhabitants of various Micronesian islands maintained similar stories. The indigenous peoples of the western coast of South America spoke of ancestral connections to lands in the Pacific. This geographic distribution of similar traditions suggests either an extremely ancient common source or an actual historical event of such magnitude that it imprinted itself on the collective memory of peoples across an entire ocean basin. The name Mu itself emerged from interpretations of ancient texts and symbols, though its etymology remains disputed among scholars. Brasser de Bourbourg believed he had identified the term in Mayan writings, though later scholars would challenge his translation methods and conclusions. The British archaeologist Augustus Le Plongeon, working extensively in the Yucatan during the 1870s, also claimed to have found references to Mu in Mayan inscriptions, describing it as the motherland of the Mayans and the source of their advanced astronomical and mathematical knowledge. Le Plongeon's work, while controversial and largely rejected by mainstream archaeology, documented numerous architectural and artistic parallels between Mayan civilization and cultures in Asia and the Pacific Islands. Parallels, he argued, could only be explained by a common ancestral civilization. The most comprehensive and influential treatment of the Mu hypothesis came from James Churchward, a British colonel and tea plantation owner who claimed to have spent years in India studying ancient temple records. Beginning in 1926 with his book, The Lost Continent of Mu, Churchward synthesized Polynesian oral traditions, archaeological anomalies, geological theories, and what he claimed were translations of ancient tablets to construct a detailed portrait of Mu as a vast continent that once occupied much of the Pacific Ocean. According to Churchward, Mu was the biblical Garden of Eden, the original homeland of humanity, a highly advanced civilization that flourished for thousands of years before its destruction approximately 12,000 years ago. The survivors, he argued, founded the civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and the Americas, explaining the numerous cultural and architectural similarities among these geographically separated cultures. Churchward's vision of Mu described a tropical paradise spanning from Hawaii to Easter Island, from Micronesia to Fiji, a landmass of approximately 5,000 miles east to west and 3,000 miles north to south. The continent supposedly supported a population of 64 million people organized into 10 tribes governed by a priest-king from a capital city called Hieratratic City, or the City of the Sun. The civilization possessed advanced technology including stone architecture, metallurgy, navigation, and writing systems. They were accomplished astronomers, mathematicians, and engineers who built massive stone monuments, developed sophisticated agricultural systems, and maintained trade networks across their vast domain. Their religion centered on the worship of natural forces and a supreme deity represented by the sun, a theology that Churchward argued later manifested in the sun worship of Egypt, Peru, and other ancient cultures. The catastrophic destruction of Mu, according to Churchward and others who built upon his work, resulted from a series of massive volcanic eruptions and earthquakes that caused the continent to fragment and sink beneath the Pacific over a period of several days or weeks. This cataclysm supposedly occurred around 10,000 to 12,000 BC, roughly coinciding with the end of the last ice age and the beginning of the Holocene epoch. The destruction was not instantaneous, but involved progressive subsidence as gas chambers beneath the continent collapsed, dropping massive sections of land below sea level. Tidal waves generated by this catastrophe swept across the Pacific and beyond, devastating coastal regions worldwide. The few survivors who managed to escape by boat carried their knowledge to distant shores, becoming the culture bearers who taught primitive peoples agriculture, architecture, writing, and civilization. This narrative of a lost motherland destroyed by natural catastrophe resonated deeply with various cultural traditions beyond the Pacific. Plato's account of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean followed a similar pattern, an advanced island civilization destroyed in a single day and night by earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the waves. Hindu texts described the destruction of Kumari Kandam, a lost continent in the Indian Ocean that was swallowed by the sea. Japanese legends spoke of Ryugujo, an undersea kingdom. The universality of flood myths and stories of lost lands across human cultures suggested to some researchers that these might preserve fragmentary memories of actual events, perhaps multiple continental subsidences during periods of dramatic climate change and rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. The geological possibility of a Pacific continent existing in relatively recent geological time became a point of significant debate. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, when the theory of continental drift was not yet accepted and the mechanisms of plate tectonics remained unknown, the idea that continents could rise and sink seemed plausible to some scientists. Various geological theories attempted to explain the distribution of similar fossils and rock types across now separated landmasses by proposing that land bridges, or even entire continents, had once connected regions now divided by oceans. The discovery that the ocean floors were not simply featureless plains, but contained underwater mountain ranges, plateaus, and seamounts added fuel to speculation about sunken lands. However, as geological understanding advanced throughout the 20th century, the concept of recently sunken Pacific continents became increasingly untenable within mainstream science. The theory of plate tectonics, firmly established by the 1960s, revealed that ocean basins and continents are fundamentally different in composition and origin. Continental crust consists primarily of lighter granitic rocks and is relatively buoyant, floating on the denser mantle beneath. Oceanic crust consists of heavier basaltic rocks and is thinner and denser than continental crust. Continents do not sink because they are inherently buoyant relative to the mantle. Ocean basins form through seafloor spreading at mid-ocean ridges, a process that creates new oceanic crust continuously while older crust is subducted beneath continental margins. The Pacific Ocean basin is ancient, with some regions containing crust more than 180 million years old, far predating the appearance of humans. This geological evidence would seem to definitively disprove the possibility of Mu as a continent that sank 12,000 years ago. Yet advocates of the Mu hypothesis argued that mainstream geology was either mistaken in its conclusions or was deliberately suppressing evidence that contradicted the accepted model. They pointed to various anomalies and unexplained features of the Pacific Basin as potential evidence of recent subsidence. Underwater plateaus and seamounts that once might have been islands or even larger land masses. Geos, flat-topped underwater mountains that show evidence of having been eroded by wave action, suggesting they once stood above sea level. Unusual rock samples dredged from the ocean floor that seemed inconsistent with standard models of oceanic crust formation. Each of these features, they argued, might represent fragments of a once continuous landmass now submerged. The question of why such evidence would be suppressed or ignored became central to the theory that Mu's existence was purposefully erased from history. Various explanations emerged, ranging from simple academic conservatism, the unwillingness of established scholars to revise their theories in the face of contradictory evidence, to more elaborate conspiracy theories involving deliberate concealment by governments, academic institutions, or secretive organizations. Some argued that acknowledgement of Mu would undermine colonial narratives about the spread of civilization from Europe and the Middle East to primitive peoples in the Pacific and Americas. Others suggested that the advanced technology attributed to Mu might include knowledge that modern powers preferred to keep hidden. Still others proposed that religious institutions suppressed evidence of Mu because it contradicted biblical chronology or theological positions about human origins. The scattered islands of the Pacific Ocean harbor architectural and archaeological mysteries that continue to puzzle researchers and that some interpret as remnants of a once unified civilization. These enigmas span thousands of miles, from the massive stone platforms of Tonga to the colossal statues of Easter Island, from the mysterious ruins of Nan Madol to the ancient structures of Yonaguni. Each site presents features that seem to exceed what conventional archaeology attributes to isolated island cultures with limited populations and resources. The question becomes whether these represent independent developments by remarkably capable societies, or whether they are connected fragments of a larger cultural heritage, pieces of a puzzle whose complete picture would reveal the lost continent of Mu. Easter Island, one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, rises from the Pacific nearly 1,300 miles from the nearest inhabited land. This tiny island, measuring only about 15 miles by 8 miles, is home to nearly 900 massive stone statues called moai, some weighing up to 80 tons and standing over 30 feet tall. The conventional archaeological interpretation holds that the Rapa Nui people who settled the island around 1200 CE carved these statues from volcanic rock quarries using stone tools, transported them across the island using wooden rollers and ropes, and erected them on stone platforms called ahu. The effort required enormous coordination, resources, and engineering sophistication, eventually straining the island's limited resources and contributing to ecological collapse and population decline. However, several aspects of Easter Island's archaeology have fueled alternative interpretations. The moai themselves display remarkable uniformity in style across the island despite being carved over several centuries, suggesting a highly organized culture with standardized artistic conventions. Many of the largest and most elaborate statues were never finished or transported from the quarries, as if the civilization that created them suddenly ceased operation. Some researchers have pointed to the precision of the stone cutting and the engineering required to transport and erect such massive objects as evidence of knowledge beyond what an isolated island culture should possess. The platforms upon which the moai stand often incorporate massive stone blocks fitted together with remarkable precision, comparable to Incan masonry in South America, raising questions about possible connections across the Pacific. Moreover, Rapa Nui oral traditions preserved accounts that differ somewhat from the conventional archaeological narrative. Traditional stories describe the moai as representing ancestors and as being moved into position by spiritual power or mana, suggesting that the actual methods used might have involved techniques or knowledge now lost. Some traditions also reference connections to other lands, speaking of the island as a fragment of a larger world that once existed in the ocean. While these stories can be interpreted symbolically, they align with the broader pattern of Pacific Island traditions describing ancestral homelands larger than the current islands. Nan Madol, located off the eastern shore of Pohnpei in Micronesia, presents perhaps the most dramatic architectural mystery in the Pacific. This complex of artificial islands built upon a coral reef consists of massive basalt structures, walls, and platforms constructed from columnar basalt logs stacked in crisscross patterns. The total weight of the basalt used in construction is estimated at approximately 750,000 metric tons. The largest stones weigh up to 50 tons each. The complex covers approximately 200 acres and includes 92 artificial islands constructed between approximately 1200 and 1500 CE, though some researchers argue for much earlier origins based on certain features and the advanced engineering knowledge required. The engineering challenges presented by Nan Madol are formidable. The basalt columns had to be quarried from sites elsewhere on Pohnpei or in neighboring islands, transported over water for distances of up to several miles, and precisely positioned to create walls up to 50 feet high and 17 feet thick. No mortar was used. The structures rely entirely on the weight and friction of the massive stones interlocked in their distinctive pattern. The conventional explanation holds that the builders used rafts to transport stones and employed ramps, levers, and large numbers of workers to position them. Yet the isolation of Pohnpei, its limited population even at historical peaks, and the absence of clear evidence for the massive social organization required for such a project have led some researchers to question whether this explanation adequately accounts for Nan Madol's existence. Local legends surrounding Nan Madol speak of the site being constructed by twin sorcerers named Olisipa and Olisopa, who used magical spells to levitate the massive stones into place. The brothers supposedly arrived in a large canoe from a distant land to the west, seeking a place to build a ceremonial center for the worship of Nanasan Sapu, the god of agriculture. While clearly mythological, these traditions might preserve memories of engineering techniques or knowledge no longer understood by later generations, or they might reference connections to a larger culture from which the builders came. Some researchers have proposed that Nan Madol might have been a major ceremonial or political center for a much larger and more organized civilization, possibly serving as a regional capital connected to other sites across Micronesia and beyond. The Yonaguni Monument, discovered in 1987 off the coast of Yonaguni Island at the southern end of the Japanese archipelago, has sparked fierce debate about whether it represents a natural geological formation or a human-made structure. The formation consists of massive stone blocks and terraces at depths of approximately 75 to 100 feet below the current sea level. Features that have attracted attention include what appear to be straight edges, right angles, flat surfaces, and stair-like structures arranged in ways that would be unusual for purely natural formations. The site also includes what some interpret as carved animals, faces, and symbols, though others see only random patterns in weathered rock. The geologist who discovered the formation, Masaaki Kimura, has argued extensively that the structure shows evidence of human modification and that it might date to around 10,000 years ago, when sea levels were significantly lower due to water being locked in glaciers, and the formation would have stood above water. If this interpretation is correct, the Yonaguni Monument would represent one of the oldest architectural structures in the world, predating Stonehenge, the pyramids of Giza, and most other well-known ancient monuments by thousands of years. The implications would be profound, suggesting that sophisticated stoneworking and architectural planning existed far earlier than conventional archaeology acknowledges, and in a geographic location not typically associated with the earliest civilizations. Mainstream geologists, however, have largely concluded that the Yonaguni Formation is a natural product of erosion and tectonic processes, noting that the local sandstone tends to fracture along regular planes that can create step-like appearances without human intervention. The straight edges and right angles, they argue, result from natural fracture patterns rather than human cutting. The absence of clear tool marks, the incorporation of natural geological features into what are claimed to be structures, and the lack of artifacts or other cultural remains nearby all argue against human construction. Yet the debate continues, with each side pointing to different features as evidence supporting their interpretation, and the site remains a focal point for those who believe evidence of ancient advanced civilizations has been systematically overlooked or dismissed. Similar underwater structures have been reported at various locations around the Pacific and Indian Oceans, though most remain poorly investigated due to the technical challenges and expense of underwater archaeology. Formations off the coasts of Okinawa, Taiwan, India and other locations have been described as showing possible evidence of human construction or modification. The submerged structures near the coast of Gujarat in India, discovered in 2001, include what some interpret as geometric patterns, stone walls, and building foundations at depths suggesting they were constructed during periods of lower sea level thousands of years ago. In most cases, detailed investigation has been limited and disagreement persists about whether these represent archaeological sites or natural formations sculpted by currents and geological processes. The possibility that coastal settlements from earlier periods of lower sea level might exist on now submerged continental shelves has gained increasing attention from mainstream archaeology. During the last ice age, which ended approximately 12,000 years ago, sea levels stood roughly 400 feet lower than today due to vast amounts of water being locked in continental ice sheets. This exposed large areas of continental shelf that are now underwater, potentially including regions where human populations lived and developed cultures. As the ice melted and sea levels rose, these coastal areas were progressively inundated, potentially preserving archaeological sites beneath the waves. If advanced cultures existed in these now submerged regions, their remains would be extremely difficult to detect and investigate using current technology. The linguistic connections among Pacific Island languages provide another layer of evidence that some interpret as supporting a once unified civilization. The Austronesian language family, which includes Hawaiian, Maori, Tahitian, Samoan, Malagasy, Tagalog, Indonesian, and numerous other languages, spans a geographic area from Madagascar in the Indian Ocean to Easter Island in the Eastern Pacific, from Taiwan in the north to New Zealand in the south. This represents one of the most widespread language families on Earth, demonstrating that at some point in the past, these now separated peoples shared a common ancestral language, which implies either a single point of origin with subsequent dispersal or extensive contact networks that unified language across vast distances. Conventional linguistic and archaeological research attributes the spread of Austronesian languages to a maritime migration that began approximately 5,000 years ago from Taiwan, with populations gradually expanding through the Philippines, Indonesia, and out into the Pacific over subsequent millennia. This out-of-Taiwan model, supported by linguistic, genetic, and archaeological evidence, sees the Polynesians as the descendants of these migrations, reaching the far corners of the Pacific only within the last 3,000 years. The remarkable navigational skills of these peoples, who crossed thousands of miles of open ocean in outrigger canoes guided by stars, currents, wave patterns, and bird behavior, explains how related cultures came to occupy such dispersed locations without requiring a lost continent to connect them. However, alternative interpretations note unusual features in the linguistic data that might suggest more complex histories. Some words and grammatical structures appear in languages separated by thousands of miles in ways that seem difficult to explain through the conventional migration model alone. Some researchers have pointed to apparent linguistic connections between Pacific languages and ancient languages of the Americas, India, and even the Middle East, suggesting trans-Pacific and trans-Indian Ocean contact much earlier than conventional history acknowledges. The presence of sweet potatoes, a South American crop, in Polynesia before European contact has been confirmed through archaeological and genetic studies, demonstrating that some level of trans-Pacific interaction occurred, though debate continues about its scale, timing, and direction. The art and mythology of Pacific cultures also show intriguing patterns that some interpret as evidence of shared origins in a common ancestral civilization. Stone tiki figures in Polynesia bear resemblances to stone moai on Easter Island, which some see as similar to stone heads in pre-Columbian American cultures, and even to ancient statuary in the Middle East and Asia. Serpent or dragon motifs appear in the mythology of Pacific Islands. In ancient Asian cultures, and in pre-Columbian America, sometimes associated with water, creation, and divine power. Creation myths across many Pacific cultures describe the world emerging from a primordial ocean or describe ancestors coming from a great land that was destroyed by water, with survivors scattering to form the current island populations. While such parallels can be explained through universal human psychological tendencies to develop similar symbols and stories independently, they can also be interpreted as fragments of actual historical memory preserved through oral tradition across millennia. The most controversial aspect of the Mu hypothesis is not whether the continent existed, but whether evidence of its existence has been systematically suppressed by academic, governmental, or other institutional forces. Proponents of this suppression theory point to various mechanisms through which knowledge might be concealed, from the simple rejection of unconventional theories by conservative academic establishments to more elaborate scenarios involving deliberate destruction of evidence and persecution of researchers who challenge orthodox historical narratives. Understanding these claims requires examining both the sociology of scientific knowledge and specific instances where alternative theories about ancient history have been marginalized or dismissed. The academic peer review system, which governs what research gets published in scientific journals and what theories gain acceptance within scholarly communities, operates through a process of evaluation by established experts in each field. While this system generally promotes rigor and prevents the spread of poorly supported claims, it can also create conservatism and resistance to paradigm-shifting ideas that challenge fundamental assumptions. Thomas Kuhn's influential work on scientific revolutions demonstrated that major changes in scientific understanding typically face fierce resistance from established scholars who have built careers on existing paradigms. New theories often gain acceptance only when a new generation of researchers, less invested in old models, enters the field and evaluates evidence without preconceptions. In archaeology and ancient history, this conservatism has sometimes delayed recognition of legitimate discoveries. The existence of Troy, described in Homer's Iliad, was dismissed as purely mythological by 19th century scholars until Heinrich Schliemann's excavations in the 1870s revealed the actual site in modern Turkey. The sophistication of Neolithic cultures was systematically underestimated until discoveries like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey revealed that hunter-gatherers were capable of monumental architecture and complex social organization more than 11,000 years ago, thousands of years earlier than conventional chronologies suggested was possible. Viking settlements in North America were dismissed as fantasy until archaeological evidence at Once Aux Meadows in Newfoundland confirmed Norse presence in the Americas around 1000 CE, 500 years before Columbus. These examples demonstrate that conventional archaeological wisdom can be wrong and that marginalized theories can sometimes be vindicated by new evidence. However, they also show that acceptance requires solid physical evidence that withstands rigorous scrutiny. The difference between Troy, Göbekli Tepe, and Lance Aux Meadows on one hand and Mu on the other is that the former were confirmed through systematic excavation producing artifacts, architectural remains, and stratigraphic evidence that could be independently verified. Mu has not been confirmed in this way, despite numerous expeditions and investigations over more than a century. The absence of definitive evidence after extensive searching becomes, for mainstream scholars, evidence of absence, an indication that Mu likely never existed rather than that its evidence has been suppressed. Proponents of the suppression theory, however, argue that the absence of publicly acknowledged evidence does not prove absence of evidence altogether. They point to various incidents where archaeological finds were allegedly dismissed, hidden, or explained away because they contradicted established chronologies. Out-of-place artifacts, objects found in geological strata or archaeological contexts that seem inconsistent with conventional dating, have occasionally been reported and then either debunked or simply ignored by mainstream archaeology. In some cases, unusual finds have been stored in museum basements and never properly studied or published. In other cases, researchers who report anomalous discoveries face professional marginalization, making others hesitant to investigate similar claims. One mechanism often cited for potential suppression involves institutional control over access to archaeological sites and materials. Major museums, universities, and government archaeological services control which sites can be excavated, who receives permits to conduct research, and what materials are available for study. If these institutions are ideologically or professionally committed to certain historical narratives, they might be unwilling to grant access to researchers pursuing alternative theories, or might discourage investigation of sites that might yield contradictory evidence. This control need not involve conscious conspiracy. Simple bureaucratic inertia, limited funding, and preference for projects that fit within established frameworks could effectively suppress unconventional research without anyone deliberately hiding truth. Religious institutions have also been identified as potential agents of suppression. Various religious traditions have specific accounts of human origins, the age of the earth, and the development of civilization that might be challenged by evidence of advanced prehistoric cultures. If Mu existed and was destroyed 12,000 years ago, this would place advanced human civilization far earlier than many religious chronologies allow. The civilization described in Churchward's work, with its own theology and spiritual practices, might be seen as contradicting claims about divine revelation or the unique status of particular religious traditions. While modern mainstream religions generally accommodate archaeological and geological findings, more conservative or fundamentalist factions might resist evidence that challenges their interpretative frameworks. Colonial and post-colonial politics have also been suggested as motivating suppression of evidence for advanced Pacific civilizations. European colonial expansion was often justified through narratives depicting colonized peoples as primitive or savage, lacking the capacity for self-governance or advanced cultural development. Evidence of sophisticated prehistoric civilizations among peoples classified as primitive would undermine these narratives and potentially challenge the legitimacy of colonial projects. Similarly, post-colonial nation-building in Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific often emphasizes indigenous achievement and continuity, which might be complicated by theories attributing advanced ancient accomplishments to now vanished civilizations rather than to ancestors of current populations. The control of knowledge through institutional means extends beyond archaeology to education systems, publishing, and media. Textbooks reflect consensus views developed by academic institutions, which means alternative theories receive little exposure in formal education. Publishers, focused on commercial viability, prefer books that align with established knowledge or that present controversial ideas in sensational ways for popular audiences rather than serious scholarly treatment. Academic conferences, where new research is presented and debated, typically invite speakers based on established credentials and mainstream affiliations, making it difficult for independent researchers or those pursuing unconventional theories to participate in scholarly discourse. This creates a self-reinforcing system where certain ideas remain marginalized regardless of their potential merit. Some proponents of the suppression theory go further, suggesting more active concealment by governmental or secretive organizations. They point to various instances where governments have classified archaeological discoveries for national security reasons, restricted access to certain sites, or removed artifacts from public view. The Smithsonian Institution has been specifically accused by some alternative researchers of having warehoused anomalous artifacts that contradict established chronologies, though the Smithsonian denies these claims and attributes them to misunderstandings or misrepresentations of standard museum practices. Military installations occasionally occupy areas of archaeological interest, restricting civilian access for reasons unrelated to archaeology, but with the effect of preventing investigation. The motivations attributed to governmental suppression vary widely. Some theories suggest that advanced ancient technologies, if rediscovered, might threaten current power structures or economic interests. If Mu possess knowledge of alternative energy sources, advanced materials, or other technologies now lost, their rediscovery could disrupt industries based on current technologies. Other theories propose that evidence of advanced prehistoric civilizations might challenge beliefs about human progress and the superiority of modern Western civilization, leading institutions vested in these narratives to suppress contradictory evidence. Still, other theories invoke more elaborate conspiracies involving secret societies or global elites who hoard ancient knowledge for their own purposes. Evaluating these suppression claims requires distinguishing between plausible mechanisms and unfounded speculation. That academic institutions can be conservative and resistant to paradigm shifts is well documented, and does not require conspiracy. That access to sites and materials is controlled and can be denied for various reasons is similarly straightforward. That individual researchers have faced professional consequences for pursuing unpopular theories is also documented. These mechanisms could indeed result in certain lines of inquiry being discouraged or certain evidence being overlooked without requiring coordinated conspiracy. However, the more elaborate claims involving deliberate destruction of evidence, comprehensive censorship across multiple countries and institutions, and persecution of researchers require much stronger evidence to be credible. The digital age has complicated suppression efforts, if they exist, by enabling rapid dissemination of information outside traditional academic channels. Alternative theories about ancient civilizations now reach millions through books, documentaries, websites, and social media platforms. Researchers pursuing unconventional ideas can publish their work online, share photographs and data, and build audiences without going through traditional gatekeepers. This democratization of information makes comprehensive suppression increasingly difficult, though it also facilitates the spread of poorly supported claims and makes distinguishing between legitimate unconventional research and pseudoscience more challenging for non-expert audiences. As we conclude this part of our journey into the mysteries of Mu and the theories of its suppression, we would like to extend a special thank you for continuing with us. If these explorations of lost continents and hidden knowledge are bringing you comfort, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Slumber Expeditions. We would also love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us where you're listening from and what time it is there. It is always fascinating to connect with our global community of curious minds who ponder these profound mysteries. You can also share which theories or pieces of evidence have resonated most strongly with you. It would be wonderful to hear your thoughts. Now, let these revelations of scattered monuments and suppressed histories settle into your consciousness as we prepare for the final part of our exploration, where we will consider what the truth about Mu might mean for our understanding of human civilization and the deep patterns of history. The scientific debate over the possibility of sunken continents in the Pacific Ocean reflects a broader tension in the history of geology between catastrophism and uniformitarianism, between those who believe Earth's surface has been shaped primarily by sudden, dramatic events and those who emphasize slow, gradual processes operating over immense timescales. For much of the 19th century, catastrophist theories held significant influence, partly because they seemed compatible with biblical flood narratives and partly because dramatic evidence of past catastrophes, massive extinction layers, erratic boulders transported hundreds of miles from their source, and deeply buried fossil forests seemed difficult to explain through gradual processes alone. The geologist William Lothian Green, writing in the late 19th century, proposed that the Earth's surface had undergone periodic upheavals caused by the cooling and contraction of the planet's interior. According to his theory, as Earth cooled, its interior shrank while the outer crust remained relatively rigid, creating tensions that periodically released through massive earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and rapid vertical movements of large crustal blocks. Green suggested that entire regions could sink below sea level while others rose, explaining the distribution of continents and ocean basins as the result of relatively recent crustal movements rather than ancient, stable features. If such vertical movements were possible on continental scales, then continents could indeed sink and rise on timescales relevant to human history. These ideas gained support from observations of recent geological changes that demonstrated the dynamic nature of Earth's crust. The 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, a volcanic island in the strait between Java and Sumatra, destroyed most of the island in a catastrophic explosion and generated tsunamis that killed tens of thousands of people on neighboring coasts. The violence of the eruption demonstrated that geological processes could produce catastrophic changes rapidly, reshaping geography in hours rather than millennia. The earthquake that struck San Francisco in 1906, the eruption of Mount Pelee in 1902 that destroyed the city of Saint Pierre in Martinique, and numerous other disasters showed that Earth's crust was not stable, but could shift suddenly and dramatically. If such changes could occur on the scale of islands and cities, might they also occur on the scale of entire continents? However, by the mid-20th century, accumulating evidence fundamentally changed geological understanding of how Earth's crust behaves. The theory of plate tectonics, which emerged from decades of research in seismology, paleomagnetism, and ocean floor geology, revealed that Earth's lithosphere consists of several large plates that move relative to one another at rates of a few centimeters per year. These plates float on the underlying asthenosphere, a partially molten layer of the upper mantle. Where plates collide, one may be subducted beneath the other, creating deep ocean trenches and volcanic arcs. Where plates pull apart, new oceanic crust forms at mid-ocean ridges through volcanic activity. This model explained countless geological observations, from the distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes to the matching coastlines of Africa and South America to the patterns of magnetic stripes on the ocean floor. Plate tectonics also revealed fundamental differences between continental and oceanic crust that make the sinking of continents physically implausible. Continental crust consists primarily of granitic rocks with relatively low density, averaging about 2.7 grams per cubic centimeter. It is thick, extending 20 to 70 kilometers beneath the surface, and is buoyant relative to the denser mantle below, which has a density of approximately 3.3 grams per cubic centimeter. Oceanic crust, in contrast, consists of basaltic rocks with a higher density of about 3.0 grams per cubic centimeter and is much thinner, only 5 to 10 kilometers thick. Because of these differences in composition and thickness, continental crust naturally floats higher than oceanic crust, forming the basis for continents and ocean basins respectively. The principle of isostasy, which describes how Earth's crust floats in gravitational equilibrium on the denser mantle, explains why continents cannot simply sink beneath the oceans. Just as an iceberg floats with most of its mass submerged and a smaller portion above water, continental crust floats on the mantle with most of its thickness below sea level, but enough above to form dry land. If additional weight is added to continental crust, it sinks deeper into the mantle, and if weight is removed, it rises. During ice ages, the weight of massive ice sheets depresses continental crust, and when the ice melts, the crust slowly rebounds upward, a process called isostatic rebound that continues today in areas like Scandinavia and Canada that were covered by ice sheets during the last glacial period. But this vertical movement occurs over thousands to tens of thousands of years and involves adjustments of a few hundred meters at most, not the sudden subsidence of entire continents by thousands of meters. For a continent the size of Mu, as described by Churchward, spanning 5,000 miles, to sink beneath the Pacific Ocean would require mechanisms that plate tectonic theory cannot accommodate. The buoyancy of continental crust means it would require enormous downward force to submerge it, force that no known geological process could provide on the timescale suggested. The Pacific ocean floor consists of oceanic crust formed at the East Pacific Rise and other mid-ocean ridges, with ages ranging from very young near the ridges to approximately 180 million years old near the western Pacific margins. Detailed magnetic surveys and seismic studies of the Pacific Basin show no evidence of submerged continental crust in the regions where Mu supposedly existed. If a continent had sunk there 12,000 years ago, fragments of continental rock should be detectable, yet none have been found despite extensive oceanographic research. However, proponents of sunken Pacific lands point to several geological features that they argue might represent remnants of a former continent or at least extensive land areas now submerged. The Emperor Seamount Chain and the Hawaiian Islands represent a volcanic chain stretching across the northern Pacific, created as the Pacific Plate moved over a stationary mantle hotspot. Some of these seamounts show evidence of having once been at or near sea level, with flat tops eroded by wave action before subsiding to their current depths. While plate tectonic theory explains these as volcanic islands that formed and then subsided as the oceanic crust on which they sat cooled and contracted while moving away from the hotspot, alternative interpretations suggest they might represent peaks of a former landmass. The Ontong Java Plateau in the western Pacific represents an enormous volcanic structure, approximately the size of Alaska, formed by massive volcanic eruptions approximately 120 million years ago. It stands several kilometers above the surrounding ocean floor, though still well below sea level, and consists of unusually thick oceanic crust created by massive lava outpourings. Some researchers have suggested that during periods of lower sea level, portions of such plateaus might have been exposed, creating substantial islands or even continent-like land masses. However, the Ontong Java Plateau formed long before humans existed, and there is no evidence that any significant portion stood above sea level during human prehistory. The Kerguelen Plateau in the southern Indian Ocean provides another example often cited in discussions of sunken lands. This submarine plateau covers approximately 1.2 million square miles and was formed by volcanic activity associated with the Kerguelen hotspot beginning approximately 130 million years ago. Geological studies indicate that portions of the plateau were above sea level at various times in the past, and some researchers have identified continental-type rocks among the plateau's composition, suggesting it might represent a fragment of continental crust that separated during the breakup of Gondwana. However, like the Ontong Java Plateau, the portions that were above water existed long before humans, and the plateau's current depth and geological history make it unsuitable as a candidate for recent human habitation. The question of sea level changes provides another dimension to the geological debate. During the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels stood roughly 400 feet lower than today due to vast quantities of water being locked up in continental ice sheets covering much of North America, Northern Europe, and other regions. This lower sea level exposed substantial areas of continental shelf that are now underwater. The English Channel was dry land connecting Britain to continental Europe. A land bridge connected Siberia to Alaska across what is now the Bering Strait. Indonesia's islands were connected in a landmass called Sundaland, and Australia was connected to New Guinea in the continent of Sahul. These exposed shelf areas represented significant additions to habitable land, and archaeological evidence confirms that humans occupied many of these now submerged regions. As the ice sheets melted between approximately 18,000 and 7,000 years ago, sea levels rose progressively, inundating these coastal lowlands and transforming geography dramatically. The process was not uniform. Periods of rapid rise alternated with periods of stability, and local factors like isostatic rebound and tectonic activity created regional variations. Some coastal areas experienced catastrophic flooding events when ice dams collapsed, releasing massive glacial lakes in sudden floods. The Black Sea, for instance, may have been a freshwater lake until approximately 7,600 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus Strait, flooding the lake basin in what some researchers have suggested might be the historical basis for flood myths in that region. Could memories of these post-glacial inundations, transmitted through oral tradition, form the basis for stories of sunken lands like Mu? The time frame roughly aligns. The end of the last ice age and the subsequent sea level rise occurred between 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, coinciding with dates proposed for Mu's destruction. However, the areas inundated by post-glacial sea level rise consisted of relatively shallow continental shelves, not deep ocean basins. The Pacific Ocean's depth in the regions where Mu supposedly existed ranges from 3 to 6 kilometers, far too deep to have been exposed even during maximum glacial low stands. While the coastlines of Pacific Islands would have been different during periods of lower sea level, with many islands larger and some that are now separate being connected, nothing approaching a continent existed in the central Pacific even at maximum glacial low stand. The presence of geos, flat-topped seamounts, throughout the Pacific has been interpreted by some as evidence of former islands that were eroded flat by wave action and then submerged. Geos do indeed represent former volcanic islands that have subsided, but their formation is well understood within plate tectonic theory. Volcanic islands form at hotspots or along mid-ocean ridges, initially standing high above sea level. Wave action erodes the peaks, creating relatively flat tops. As the oceanic crust on which they sit cools and contracts over millions of years, and as the islands move away from the volcanic source, they gradually subside below sea level, becoming geos. The process occurs over millions of years, not thousands, and the geos in the Pacific formed during the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras, long before humans existed. They cannot represent remnants of a recently sunken continent inhabited by advanced civilizations. Another geological argument sometimes advanced for sunken Pacific lands involves the interpretation of bathymetric data showing the ocean floor's topography. Modern multi-beam sonar and satellite altimetry have revealed detailed maps of underwater features, occasionally showing what appear to be linear structures, right-angle formations, or other geometric patterns on the seafloor. Most of these features have straightforward geological explanations: fault scarps, lava flows, sediment patterns, but proponents of lost civilizations sometimes interpret them as possible evidence of artificial structures now submerged. However, detailed investigation of such features typically reveals characteristics inconsistent with human construction and consistent with known geological processes. The resolution of available data, while impressive, remains insufficient to identify most human-scale structures at depths of several kilometers, meaning that if artificial structures existed at such depths, current remote sensing would likely miss them rather than detect them. The role of catastrophic events in Earth's history has gained increasing recognition in recent decades, partially vindicating earlier catastrophist perspectives while integrating them into modern geological understanding. The discovery that an asteroid impact 66 million years ago caused the extinction of the dinosaurs demonstrated that sudden, catastrophic events can indeed reshape Earth's surface and biosphere dramatically. Evidence for other massive impacts, megafloods, supervolcanic eruptions, and rapid climate changes has accumulated, showing that uniformitarian processes, while dominant over long timescales, are punctuated by catastrophes. This recognition has made geologists more open to considering rapid changes and catastrophic events in Earth's history, though within the framework of plate tectonics and established physical principles rather than returning to pre-tectonic theories of sinking continents. Could a catastrophic event 12,000 years ago have caused the submergence of significant Pacific landmasses while leaving minimal geological trace? The mechanisms proposed by early advocates of MU, gas chamber collapses causing rapid subsidence, lack physical plausibility and support from modern geology. However, other catastrophic scenarios might merit consideration. A major asteroid impact in the Pacific could have generated massive tsunamis that devastated coastal regions and island chains, potentially destroying civilizations and creating flood memories that persisted in oral tradition. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, while controversial, proposes that a comet or asteroid impact or airburst around 12,900 years ago triggered rapid climate change and widespread destruction. While mainstream geology has not embraced this hypothesis, it illustrates how catastrophic events and the time frame relevant to MU remain subjects of active research and debate. The web of cultural similarities connecting ancient civilizations separated by vast oceanic distances has long intrigued researchers and provided fuel for theories of lost common origins. Pyramid structures appear in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and even in modified form in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Megalithic stone construction, involving the precise fitting of massive blocks without mortar, appears in Peru, Easter Island, parts of the Mediterranean, and elsewhere. Sophisticated astronomical knowledge, complex calendrical systems, and mathematical concepts like zero developed independently according to conventional history, yet show intriguing parallels. Could these similarities result from diffusion from a common source, perhaps MU, or do they represent convergent evolution, with different cultures independently developing similar solutions to similar problems? The pyramid form represents one of the most striking parallels. The Egyptian pyramids at Giza, built around 4,500 years ago, rank among humanity's most impressive architectural achievements. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, stepped pyramidal structures serving as temple platforms, date to similar periods. Halfway around the world, the Olmec, Maya, and later Aztec civilizations built stepped pyramids in Mesoamerica, structures that served both religious and astronomical functions. In Indonesia, Borobudur represents a different variation on the pyramidal form, while structures like Wat Phu in Laos and various temple mountains in Southeast Asia reflect similar architectural thinking. Even more provocatively, some researchers have identified pyramid-like structures in China, including the Shamshi pyramids, though these are generally interpreted as elaborate burial mounds rather than constructed pyramids in the Egyptian sense. The question becomes whether these similarities reflect diffusion from a common source or independent invention. The pyramid form has certain practical advantages that might lead multiple cultures to develop it independently. A pyramid is stable. Its wide base and tapering form resist collapse better than vertical walls when constructing large structures with pre-industrial technology. A pyramid is visible. Its height makes it an effective landmark and symbol of power or religious significance. A pyramid naturally suggests a connection between earth and sky, making it symbolically appropriate for religious structures and cultures that conceive of heaven as being above. These practical and symbolic advantages might explain why multiple cultures independently hit upon similar forms without requiring any connection between them. However, proponents of diffusionist theories point to more specific similarities that seem harder to explain through convergence. Both Egyptian and Mesoamerican pyramids align precisely with cardinal directions and incorporate astronomical orientations in their design. Both traditions associate pyramids with the afterlife and with the journey of the soul to the realm of the dead. Both use the pyramid as a tomb or memorial for important individuals. Both incorporate sophisticated mathematical knowledge in their proportions and layouts. Both appear relatively suddenly in the archaeological record without clear developmental antecedents, showing gradual evolution from simpler structures. These specific shared features, diffusionists argue, suggest actual historical connections rather than coincidental parallel development. The case of megalithic construction provides another intriguing parallel. In Peru, Incan and pre-Incan cultures built stone walls by fitting massive blocks together so precisely that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them, accomplished without mortar. On Easter Island, the Oahu platforms supporting the moai incorporate similar precision stonework. In the Mediterranean, various Bronze Age and earlier cultures built megalithic structures using carefully fitted large stones. In Japan, the walls of certain castles and fortifications display similar techniques. The engineering knowledge required to shape irregular stone blocks so that they fit together perfectly, to transport stones weighing many tons over difficult terrain, and to position them precisely without modern equipment seems sophisticated enough that independent development in multiple locations might seem unlikely. Yet here too, mainstream archaeology sees convergent evolution rather than diffusion. The techniques for working stone, while sophisticated, are ultimately discoverable through trial and error and observation. Cultures that need to build with stone in regions where wood is scarce or where stone's permanence is valued would naturally experiment with methods of shaping and fitting stones. Once basic techniques are discovered, refinement through practice and generational transmission of knowledge can lead to very high levels of skill. The fact that different cultures using megalithic construction employ somewhat different specific techniques, different types of stone, different methods of quarrying and transport, different architectural contexts, suggests independent development rather than transmission of a unified tradition. Astronomical knowledge provides another area of intriguing parallels. The Maya developed an extremely accurate calendar based on detailed astronomical observations, including precise measurements of a solar year, the lunar month, and the cycles of Venus and other planets. This knowledge allowed them to predict eclipses and astronomical events with remarkable accuracy. Ancient Egyptian astronomy was similarly sophisticated, allowing precise calendar keeping and incorporation of astronomical alignments into architecture. The builders of Stonehenge in Britain clearly possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, as the monument's alignment with solstice sunrises and sunsets demonstrates. In Polynesia, traditional navigation relied on detailed knowledge of stars, their rising and setting points, and their movements through the night sky. Are these independent developments, or might they trace to a common source that preserved and transmitted astronomical knowledge across ancient cultures? The practical importance of astronomical knowledge for agriculture, navigation, and timekeeping means that nearly all complex societies develop some level of astronomical observation and record keeping. The basic phenomena, the daily rotation of the sky, the annual cycle of the sun, the monthly cycle of the moon, the movements of planets, are universal and observable from any location on Earth. What varies is how different cultures interpret and utilize these observations. The parallels in astronomical knowledge might therefore reflect the universality of the phenomena being observed rather than transmission from a common source. However, certain specific shared elements continue to intrigue researchers. The division of the day into 24 hours and the circle into 360 degrees, both based on the sexagesimal base 60 number system developed in ancient Mesopotamia, appears in various cultures, suggesting at least some level of cultural transmission, though through historically documented trade routes rather than requiring a lost continent. The apparent presence of transoceanic contacts in prehistory provides perhaps the strongest evidence for more extensive ancient connections than conventional history acknowledges. The presence of sweet potatoes, native to South America, in Polynesia before European contact has been confirmed through both archaeological and genetic evidence. This unambiguous proof of contact between South America and Polynesia in prehistoric times demonstrates that the Pacific Ocean, while vast, was not an impassable barrier. The chickens of pre-Columbian Chile also show genetic connections to Polynesian chickens, further supporting ancient contact. If such contact occurred, what else might have been exchanged? Could cultural practices, technological knowledge, or artistic motifs have traveled along with crops and animals? The Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl famously argued for extensive ancient transoceanic contact, conducting experimental voyages like the Kon-Tiki expedition in 1947, sailing a balsa wood raft from Peru to Polynesia to demonstrate the feasibility of such journeys. While Heyerdahl's specific theories about the direction and significance of these contacts have not been fully accepted by mainstream archaeology, his voyages demonstrated that primitive watercraft could indeed cross vast ocean distances, making ancient contact possible even if not proven. Later research has revealed that the sweet potato most likely traveled from South America to Polynesia rather than vice versa, and that Polynesians were capable of reaching South America and returning, given their demonstrated navigational abilities and the seaworthy qualities of their outrigger canoes. Could Mu have been the intermediary in these transoceanic contacts, serving as a central hub from which culture, crops, and knowledge spread to both Asia and the Americas? This interpretation faces the problem that the genetic and linguistic evidence shows clear patterns of migration that can be traced without requiring an intermediate lost continent. The Austronesian expansion from Taiwan through the Pacific can be tracked through language relationships, genetic markers, and archaeological remains showing a clear temporal progression. The settlement of the Americas occurred via the Bering Land Bridge from Asia during the last ice age, as demonstrated by genetic studies, archaeological sites, and the distribution of language families. These well-documented migration patterns leave little room for a major lost civilization serving as an intermediary, though they do not rule out smaller-scale contacts and influences that conventional history might have overlooked. Human memory, whether individual or cultural, is inherently fragile and subject to distortion, loss, and reconstruction. The question of whether Mu was purposely erased from history requires understanding how historical knowledge is transmitted, how it can be lost, and how the absence of information can result from either active suppression or simply the passage of time and the limitations of oral tradition and early writing systems. Every culture loses aspects of its own history, particularly knowledge from periods before writing or from groups that left no written records. The challenge lies in distinguishing between natural historical amnesia and deliberate erasure, and in evaluating what fragmentary evidence might actually preserve. Oral tradition, humanity's primary method of transmitting knowledge across generations before the development of writing, possesses both remarkable strengths and significant limitations. Some oral traditions have preserved accurate historical information across many generations, with specialized memorizers maintaining detailed genealogies, migration histories, and event descriptions through careful repetition, and cultural institutions designed to ensure accuracy. The Polynesian navigators maintained detailed knowledge of star paths, island locations, and sailing techniques through oral instruction over many generations, knowledge that allowed them to navigate the Pacific with remarkable precision. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions preserve what appear to be accurate descriptions of landscape features that existed thousands of years ago before sea level rise, suggesting that some oral knowledge can persist for extremely long periods. However, oral traditions also naturally transform over time through a process that blends historical memory with mythological elaboration, moral lessons, and symbolic meaning. Events become compressed or expanded in time. Multiple historical events may merge into single narratives, and the boundary between literal history and symbolic or allegorical meaning becomes blurred. The story of a catastrophic flood destroying a coastal settlement might become, over thousands of years of retelling, the story of the entire world being destroyed by flood. The memory of migration from one island to another might transform into a myth of emergence from a land beneath the sea. Distinguishing the historical kernel from the mythological elaboration requires careful analysis, and even when done skillfully, certainty often remains elusive. The development of writing systems should theoretically have provided more reliable transmission of historical knowledge, but early writing systems had their own limitations. Many early civilizations used writing primarily for administrative purposes, recording taxes, trade transactions, inventories, rather than for historical narratives. The materials used for writing, whether papyrus, palm leaves, bark cloth, or unfired clay tablets, were often perishable, meaning most written records from ancient times have been lost to decay, fire, or deliberate destruction. The libraries and archives that preserved collective knowledge were vulnerable to catastrophe, whether accidental fires like those that damaged the Library of Alexandria multiple times, or deliberate destruction during conquest, revolution, or religious reformation. The loss of ancient libraries represents one of history's great tragedies and a mechanism through which knowledge can be irretrievably lost without requiring conspiracy. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE and perhaps the greatest repository of ancient knowledge, suffered multiple fires and periods of decline before its final destruction sometime between the 3rd and 7th centuries CE. Estimates suggest it contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, representing much of the accumulated knowledge of the ancient Mediterranean world, Near East, and beyond. Most of this material is lost forever, known only through references in surviving texts. Similarly, the destruction of Mayan codices by Spanish conquistadors and missionaries in the 16th century eliminated nearly all written records of Mayan civilization, leaving only 4 codices known to have survived. The knowledge contained in these lost texts, history, astronomy, mathematics, religion, literature, is irrecoverable except where fragments were copied into other surviving sources. If Mu existed and left written records, their survival would have faced enormous challenges. Depending on when the continent supposedly sank, these records would need to have been either preserved on Mu itself and somehow remained accessible despite the landmass being submerged, or carried away by survivors who then preserved them in their new homelands. Underwater preservation of written materials is extremely unlikely unless they were stone inscriptions, and even stone erodes and becomes covered by sediment over millennia. The survivors would need to have maintained these records through subsequent generations, but if Mu's writing system was unique to that civilization, who would be able to read it after the original readers died? Writing systems require literate communities to remain comprehensible, and isolated texts in unknown scripts often prove indecipherable, as demonstrated by scripts like Linear A from Bronze Age Crete, which remains undeciphered despite decades of scholarly effort. The claim that references to Mu exist in various ancient texts but have been mistranslated, suppressed, or ignored requires examining how ancient texts are actually studied and interpreted. Modern scholarly translation and interpretation of ancient texts involves extensive peer review, comparison between multiple manuscripts where available, application of rigorous linguistic methods, and consideration of archaeological and historical context. While mistakes certainly occur and interpretations evolve as knowledge increases, the idea that clear references to a major civilization have been consistently mistranslated or ignored across multiple independent scholarly traditions in different countries seems implausible without coordinated suppression. Brasser de Bourbourg's original translation of supposed Mayan references to Mu has been thoroughly discredited by later Mayan scholars who demonstrated that his interpretation of the symbols was fundamentally flawed. He had attempted to read Mayan glyphs using a mistaken key that mapped glyphs to Spanish letters, producing nonsensical translations. Modern decipherment of Mayan writing, accomplished primarily in the latter half of the 20th century, has revealed a complex logosyllabic system completely different from what Brasser imagined, and authentic Mayan texts make no reference to Mu or to a sunken Pacific continent. The texts describe Mayan history, mythology, and astronomy, but within a geographic framework consistent with Mesoamerica, not a lost Pacific homeland. James Churchward's claimed translations of ancient tablets from India supposedly describing Mu face similar credibility problems. Churchward never produced the actual tablets or provided photographs of them, making independent verification impossible. His descriptions of their content and the circumstances of their discovery are vague and unverifiable. Scholars of ancient Indian languages and scripts have found no support for his translations in authentic ancient Indian texts. While ancient Indian literature is vast and much remains untranslated or understudied, the complete absence of corroboration for Churchward's dramatic claims, combined with his inability or unwillingness to provide primary source materials, makes most scholars dismiss his work as fabrication or a fantasy rather than legitimate scholarship. This pattern, claims of ancient texts describing Mu that cannot be verified, that depend on idiosyncratic translations contradicted by mainstream scholarship, or that involve materials that conveniently cannot be examined, suggests that many references to Mu in ancient sources are modern constructions rather than authentic ancient knowledge. This does not necessarily mean deliberate fraud in all cases. True believers in a theory may convince themselves they have found supporting evidence where more skeptical observers see only ambiguity or a misinterpretation. The human mind excels at pattern recognition, sometimes too well, finding meaningful patterns in random data or interpreting ambiguous information in ways that confirm existing beliefs. This confirmation bias operates in all of us and requires disciplined methodology to counteract. However, the possibility remains that some genuine historical knowledge of prehistoric cultures has been lost, misunderstood, or inadequately investigated. The example of Göbekli Tepe is instructive. This massive complex of megalithic structures in Turkey, dated to approximately 11,500 years ago, was completely unknown to archaeology until its discovery in the 1990s, despite being a hill covered with stone structures in a region that had been surveyed. Its existence and sophistication contradicted prevailing theories about the capabilities of pre-agricultural societies, forcing significant revision of understanding about the Neolithic period. If such a major site could remain unknown or misidentified for so long, what else might remain undiscovered or misinterpreted? The Pacific Ocean, covering a third of Earth's surface, much of it unexplored in detail, could conceivably harbor submerged archaeological sites that would substantially change our understanding of prehistoric cultures if discovered and properly investigated. As we conclude this part of our journey through the cultural enigmas and lost knowledge surrounding Mu, we would like to extend a special thank you for continuing with us through these deep explorations. If you are finding comfort in these investigations of ancient mysteries and forgotten civilizations, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Slumber Expeditions. We would also love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us where you're listening from and what time it is there. it is always fascinating to connect with our global community of curious minds who share this passion for uncovering hidden truths. You can also share which aspects of this story have intrigued you most deeply. It would be wonderful to hear your perspectives. Now, let these reflections on lost libraries and fading memories settle in your mind as we prepare for the final part of our exploration, where we will consider what the legend of Mu ultimately means for humanity's understanding of itself and the deep patterns of history that connect us to our most distant ancestors. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen numerous expeditions attempting to locate physical evidence of Mu or other sunken lands in the Pacific Ocean. These searches have employed increasingly sophisticated technology, from early diving bells and dredging operations to modern sonar mapping, submersibles, and remote sensing satellites. While none have produced definitive proof of a sunken continent, they have revealed unexpected features of the Pacific seafloor and occasionally discovered archaeological sites that challenge conventional chronologies, keeping the search alive and suggesting that mysteries remain despite the conclusions of mainstream geology. Early 20th century searches for Mu relied primarily on dredging operations and depth soundings to map the ocean floor's topography and collect rock samples from underwater features. The expedition led by William Niven in the 1920s, though primarily focused on archaeological excavations in Mexico, where he claimed to find tablets supporting Churchward's theories, inspired interest in oceanic searches. Several independent researchers and explorers conducted surveys of Pacific seamounts and underwater plateaus, hoping to find evidence of former islands or continental fragments. These early efforts were hampered by limited technology. Depth soundings required dropping weighted lines and waiting for them to hit bottom, a time-consuming process that provided only scattered data points rather than comprehensive maps. The development of sonar technology during and after World War II revolutionized oceanographic mapping. Echo sounding allowed continuous mapping of ocean depth while ships were underway, gradually revealing the detailed topography of the seafloor. These surveys discovered the vast mid-ocean ridge system, the deep ocean trenches, and countless seamounts and underwater plateaus. Each newly discovered underwater feature prompted speculation about whether it might represent a former island or part of a sunken continent. The Emperor Seamount chain, the Musician Seamounts, the Line Islands, and numerous other Pacific features were examined for evidence of former subaerial exposure or human habitation. In the 1960s and 1970s, as plate tectonic theory became firmly established and detailed mapping of the Pacific floor progressed, mainstream science largely abandoned the possibility of recently sunken continents. However, alternative researchers continued investigating, focusing on features that seemed anomalous or unusual. The discovery of what appeared to be terrace structures on certain seamounts prompted speculation about artificial modification, though most of these features were eventually explained as natural lava flow formations or fault scarps. Rock samples dredged from various seamounts occasionally included rocks of unusual composition that prompted brief excitement, but detailed analysis typically revealed explanations consistent with volcanic or tectonic processes rather than evidence of former continents. The development of submersible technology and remotely operated vehicles allowed direct observation of the deep ocean floor for the first time. The famous submersible Alvin, which discovered hydrothermal vents in 1977, also participated in numerous geological surveys of Pacific underwater features. Commercial and military submarines occasionally reported unusual sonar contacts or visual observations that fueled speculation about underwater ruins or structures. However, the vast majority of reported anomalies proved on closer inspection to be natural geological features, unusual but explainable formations, or sensor artifacts. The few cases that remained unexplained after investigation typically suffered from lack of detailed data rather than positive evidence of artificial structures. Jacques Cousteau's expeditions in the 1970s and 1980s, while not specifically searching for Mu, explored numerous specific underwater sites and brought high-quality underwater imagery to public attention. Some of his footage showed dramatic underwater landscapes, cliff faces, boulder fields, cave systems that appeared strikingly artificial or organized but were natural formations. These images illustrated both the wonders of the deep ocean and the difficulty of distinguishing natural from artificial structures based on appearance alone. Without clear evidence of tool marks, regular patterns that could not result from natural fracture or erosion, or associated artifacts, even impressive-looking formations cannot be confidently identified as archaeological sites. The investigation of the Yonaguni Monument beginning in the 1990s represented perhaps the most sustained modern effort to document a potentially artificial underwater structure in the Pacific. Masaaki Kimura led numerous diving expeditions to the site, producing extensive video documentation, measurements, and analysis. His work identified what he interpreted as stairs, platforms, carved animals, and other features suggesting human modification. However, each feature he identified as artificial was countered by geologists pointing to natural explanations: the regular fracture patterns of the local sandstone, the erosional effects of currents, the lack of tool marks or other definitive evidence of human work. The debate became a case study in how different interpretive frameworks can lead to completely different conclusions from the same physical evidence. Modern satellite technology has added a new dimension to searches for underwater archaeological sites. Satellite altimetry can detect subtle variations in sea surface height caused by gravitational anomalies resulting from underwater topography. Combining this data with multi-beam sonar surveys conducted by ships has produced increasingly detailed maps of the entire ocean floor. Analysis of these maps occasionally reveals features that appear unusual or geometric, prompting calls for detailed investigation. However, the resolution of satellite data remains insufficient to detect most human-scale structures, and the expense of mounting deep-sea investigations means that only the most promising sites receive detailed examination. One area of modern research with potential relevance to sunken lands involves mapping submerged coastlines from periods of lower sea level. As previously noted, sea levels during the last glacial maximum stood approximately 400 feet lower than today, exposing extensive continental shelf areas. Archaeologists have begun systematically surveying these now submerged shelves, particularly in areas where prehistoric human populations are known to have existed nearby, to locate potential archaeological sites. This research has discovered submerged forest remains, river channels, and in a few cases, possible artifact scatters and structural remains. While these discoveries do not support the existence of Mu, they demonstrate that significant archaeological sites exist underwater and that humanity's coastal prehistory has been literally submerged by rising seas. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in 1997, illustrates how dramatic flooding events in human prehistory might underlie flood myths. They propose that around 7,600 years ago, the Mediterranean Sea breached a natural dam at the Bosporus Strait, catastrophically flooding the Black Sea basin, which had been a lower freshwater lake. If this occurred, it would have submerged extensive coastal settlements around the former lake, forcing mass migrations and creating traumatic cultural memories that might have been preserved in regional flood myths. While the hypothesis remains controversial and the evidence is debated, it demonstrates how real geological events causing dramatic flooding and land loss can occur and can have profound cultural impacts. Could something similar have occurred in the Pacific on a larger scale, submerging not an entire continent, but perhaps an extensive archipelago or series of large islands during the post-glacial sea level rise? The gradual nature of most sea level rise, occurring over thousands of years at rates of roughly half an inch to several inches per year, would seem to argue against catastrophic memories. However, the process was not uniform. Meltwater pulses, when ice sheets collapsed rapidly, could raise sea levels by meters within decades or centuries. The meltwater pulse 1A around 14,600 years ago may have raised sea levels by approximately 40 to 60 feet in just a few centuries. Such rapid rises could indeed have catastrophically affected coastal populations, submerging settlements, disrupting trade routes, and forcing migrations that would leave lasting cultural impacts. If Pacific Island populations experienced such catastrophic flooding, their oral traditions might preserve these memories as stories of ancestral homelands being swallowed by the sea. The specific details, the size of the lands involved, the nature of the civilizations lost, the mechanisms of destruction, would naturally become embellished and transformed through millennia of retelling. A series of large islands might become remembered as a continent. Multiple flooding events might merge into a single catastrophic night. Normal prehistorical cultures might become attributed with advanced knowledge as later generations assumed their ancestors must have been extraordinary to have accomplished what they did. In this interpretation, Mu represents a mythologized memory of real but less dramatic events, the inundation of Pacific coastal areas and islands during post-glacial sea level rise. The history of how Mu and similar lost continent theories have been received and utilized reveals uncomfortable truths about colonialism, racism, and the politics of historical interpretation. The late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the Mu hypothesis gained prominence, were also the height of European colonial expansion and the development of racial hierarchies that justified colonial domination. In this context, lost continent theories serve complex and sometimes contradictory purposes, used by some to valorize non-European civilizations while simultaneously denying indigenous peoples credit for their own achievements. The European colonial project relied partly on narratives depicting colonized peoples as primitive, savage, or childlike, lacking the capacity for self-governance, advanced culture, or technological sophistication. This narrative justified colonial rule as a civilizing mission bringing progress to backward populations. However, Europeans encountered numerous impressive archaeological remains in colonized regions: the pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the temples of India, the cities of the Americas. These structures clearly demonstrated sophisticated engineering, mathematics, and social organization. If the peoples currently inhabiting these regions were primitive as colonial ideology claimed, who had built these impressive monuments? One solution to this paradox involved attributing ancient achievements to vanished races or civilizations that were supposedly superior to current indigenous populations. This approach allowed colonialists to marvel at ancient monuments while maintaining beliefs about the inferiority of living indigenous peoples. The Egyptian pyramids were sometimes attributed to a now-vanished race of superior builders rather than to the ancestors of modern Egyptians. Mesoamerican pyramids were said to have been built by mysterious vanished peoples, perhaps connected to Atlantis or other lost civilizations, rather than by the ancestors of the Maya, Aztec, or other indigenous groups. Similar narratives arose regarding megalithic structures, advanced astronomical knowledge, and other impressive achievements found in colonized regions. The Mu hypothesis fit naturally into these patterns, offering an explanation for impressive Pacific archaeological remains that denied full credit to Polynesian, Micronesian, and other Pacific peoples. Rather than recognizing the Easter Island Moai as achievements of the Rapa Nui people themselves, the lost continent narrative could attribute them to survivors of Mu bringing advanced knowledge from a vanished civilization. Rather than acknowledging the navigational genius of Polynesian seafarers who colonized the Pacific using sophisticated techniques passed through oral tradition, one could attribute their spread to survivors fleeing from a sinking continent. The pattern consistently involved denying indigenous peoples agency and credit for their own history and achievements. However, the relationship between lost continent theories and colonialism was complex and sometimes contradictory. Some advocates of Mu, including Churchward, seemed genuinely interested in challenging Eurocentric historical narratives that place civilization's origins in the Mediterranean and Near East. By proposing that the oldest, most advanced civilization arose in the Pacific and spread from there to Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and the Americas, these theories could be read as valorizing non-European peoples and challenging the narrative of European civilizational superiority. Some indigenous intellectuals and activists embraced lost continent theories precisely because they offered alternative historical narratives to colonial ones, providing pride in ancient heritage and challenging European claims to unique cultural achievements. The relationship between Mu theories and indigenous Pacific peoples themselves has varied significantly across time and place. Some Polynesian, Micronesian, and other Pacific communities have incorporated elements of the Mu narrative into their own cultural identities, seeing it as validating oral traditions about ancestral homelands and as providing an alternative to colonial historical narratives that minimized indigenous achievements. Other communities have rejected the Mu hypothesis as another form of colonialism, outsiders imposing their interpretations on indigenous history rather than listening to how indigenous peoples understand their own past. This tension reflects broader debates about who has authority to interpret the past and whether alternative theories that seem to empower marginalized groups ultimately serve or undermine their interests. The use of lost continent theories to explain cultural achievements also carries implicit racist assumptions about what different peoples are capable of accomplishing. When European archaeologists encountered sophisticated ancient structures in Africa, Asia, or the Americas, the immediate assumption that these could not have been built by ancestors of current populations reflected beliefs about racial hierarchies and capacities. Modern archaeology has thoroughly documented that all human populations, given appropriate environmental conditions and social organization, are capable of sophisticated cultural achievements. The Maya did build their pyramids through their own ingenuity and labor. The Rapa Nui people did carve and erect their moai through remarkable engineering and social coordination. Polynesian navigators did colonize the Pacific through extraordinary seafaring skills. Attributing these achievements to vanished races or lost continents is unnecessary and often reflects prejudice more than evidence. Yet the question remains whether rejecting lost continent theories means accepting all aspects of conventional historical narratives, which themselves have been shaped by colonial and Eurocentric perspectives. Mainstream archaeology has made enormous progress in recognizing indigenous knowledge, involving indigenous communities in research, and developing more culturally sensitive and inclusive approaches to studying the past. However, the field still struggles with legacies of colonialism, including the removal of artifacts and human remains from indigenous lands, the privileging of written sources over oral tradition, and institutional structures that have historically excluded indigenous voices. In this context, some indigenous scholars and communities continue to find value in alternative historical narratives, including modified versions of lost continent theories, as ways of asserting ownership over their own history and challenging academic monopolies on interpreting the past. The politics of historical interpretation extend beyond colonialism to questions of nationalism, identity, and Cultural continuity. Modern nation-states often construct official historical narratives that serve contemporary political purposes, establishing territorial claims, building national unity, justifying political systems, or supporting particular group identities. Archaeological discoveries and historical interpretations that contradict official narratives may face resistance or suppression not because of truth or falsehood, but because of political implications. In some cases, evidence of advanced prehistoric cultures or of extensive ancient migrations may be politically inconvenient, leading governments or institutions to discourage research or suppress findings. For instance, the question of when humans first arrived in the Americas has significant legal and political implications for indigenous land claims and sovereignty. Earlier dates for human presence strengthen indigenous claims to priority and reduce the perceived legitimacy of European colonization. Research suggesting very early dates for American peopling, potentially before the last glacial maximum, has sometimes faced resistance partly because of these political implications, though the primary debates remain scientific rather than political. Similarly, questions about ancient transoceanic contacts can become politically charged when they touch on issues of who discovered or first civilized particular regions. These political dimensions complicate efforts to evaluate evidence objectively and can create environments where unconventional theories are either suppressed or embraced for reasons having little to do with their scholarly merit. The internet age has democratized access to information and enabled alternative theories to reach wide audiences without passing through traditional academic gatekeepers. This development has positive and negative aspects. On the positive side, it allows independent researchers, indigenous scholars, and others outside mainstream academia to share their work and perspectives, potentially correcting blind spots in conventional scholarship. It enables people worldwide to access primary sources, photographs of sites, and diverse interpretations rather than being limited to what institutions choose to publish. On the negative side, it also facilitates the spread of poorly supported claims, pseudoscience, and deliberate misinformation, making it harder for non-experts to distinguish between credible scholarship and fantasy. The phenomenon of ancient aliens theories represents an evolution and intensification of lost continent narratives, attributing ancient achievements to extraterrestrial intervention rather than to lost human civilizations. These theories, popularized through books, television programs, and online content, follow similar patterns to moon narratives, pointing to impressive ancient structures, claiming conventional archaeology cannot explain them, and proposing alternative explanations involving advanced outside intervention. Like Mu theories, ancient alien narratives can be read as implicitly racist in their assumption that ancient non-European peoples could not have accomplished what they clearly did accomplish without outside help. Yet many proponents see themselves as challenging scientific orthodoxy and empowering alternative ways of thinking about history. The question of erasure, whether active suppression or simple forgetting, ultimately depends on what one believes existed to be erased. If Mu was a vast continent supporting an advanced civilization, its complete disappearance from the historical record without leaving definitive archaeological or geological evidence would indeed require either remarkably thorough erasure or an extraordinary sequence of unlucky circumstances that prevented evidence preservation. If Mu represents instead a mythologized memory of more modest historical realities, islands and coastal areas lost to rising seas, normal prehistoric cultures whose achievements have been exaggerated through oral tradition, then its absence from the historical record requires no special explanation. Oral traditions preserved fragmentary memories, which were then elaborated, reinterpreted, and synthesized by modern writers into the Mu narrative we know today. As we approach the end of our exploration through the mysteries of Mu, we find ourselves confronting questions that extend beyond the specific claims about a sunken Pacific continent to broader issues about how we understand history, how we remember the past, and what the concept of lost civilizations reveals about human psychology and culture. Whether or not Mu existed in any form, the persistent fascination with the idea tells us something important about human needs, fears, and aspirations, about our relationship with deep time and vanished worlds. The appeal of lost continent theories connects to fundamental aspects of human imagination and meaning-making. There is something deeply compelling about the idea that the familiar world contains hidden depths, that beneath the surface of known history lie other histories now forgotten, that our ancestors possessed knowledge or capabilities that have been lost. This appeal operates partly through the romantic attraction of mystery itself, the pleasure of speculation, the excitement of potentially revolutionary discoveries, the satisfaction of holding knowledge that mainstream authorities dismiss or suppress. It operates partly through a sense that conventional narratives are incomplete or somehow unsatisfying, that there must be more to the story than we have been told. Lost continent theories also speak to anxieties about civilization's fragility and the impermanence of human achievements. If a civilization as advanced as Mu supposedly was could be completely destroyed and forgotten within a few thousand years, what does that suggest about the survival prospects of our own civilization? The contemporary world faces numerous potential catastrophes: climate change, nuclear war, pandemics, resource depletion, any of which could, at their worst, lead to civilizational collapse. The Mu narrative provides a mythic template for understanding such collapse, a story that both acknowledges civilization's vulnerability and suggests that even after catastrophic destruction, survivors might preserve and transmit knowledge to rebuild. There is both warning and hope in the narrative. The theme of forbidden or suppressed knowledge that appears in Mu theories and similar alternative histories also resonates with common psychological patterns and cultural narratives. The idea that powerful institutions hide truth from ordinary people appears across political ideologies and cultural contexts, reflecting real experiences of censorship, propaganda, and institutional dishonesty, while sometimes extending into paranoid fantasies about comprehensive conspiracies. In a complex world where individuals have limited ability to verify claims directly and must rely on institutions and experts whose motivations and reliability are sometimes questionable, theories about suppressed knowledge provide explanatory frameworks that validate suspicions and skepticism. However, the appeal to suppressed knowledge can also become an intellectual trap, a way of insulating beliefs from critical examination. If lack of evidence for a claim is interpreted as evidence of suppression rather than evidence against a claim itself, the belief becomes unfalsifiable. No possible evidence could disprove it because absence of evidence is explained as being caused by the suppression. This logical structure appears in various conspiracy theories and pseudoscientific claims, protecting them from revision through evidence while giving adherents a sense of possessing special knowledge hidden from the masses. Critical thinking requires distinguishing between healthy skepticism toward institutional claims and reflexive rejection of mainstream knowledge simply because it is mainstream. The academic study of lost continent theories and similar alternative histories has evolved from simple dismissal toward more nuanced engagement that takes seriously the cultural work these narratives perform. Anthropologists, folklorists, and historians of science study how these beliefs emerge, spread, and function within different communities, examining what needs they fulfill and what they reveal about the cultures that embrace them. This approach recognizes that beliefs need not be literally true to be culturally significant, and that dismissing alternative theories without understanding their appeal and function misses important insights into how people make sense of their world. The literal question of whether Mu existed remains important from a scientific and historical perspective. The geological and archaeological evidence strongly indicates that no continent-sized landmass existed in the Pacific and sank within the time frame relevant to human history. The ocean floor geology, plate tectonic mechanisms, and absence of definitive archaeological evidence all argue against the hypothesis as originally formulated. However, more modest versions of the basic idea that Pacific islands and coastal regions now submerged once supported significant human populations, that post-glacial sea level rise destroyed settlements and disrupted cultures, that oral traditions preserve distant memories of these events, remain plausible and even likely. The challenge lies in distinguishing what aspects of the Mu narrative might preserve historical truth from what represents later elaboration and mythologization. Research into submerged archaeological sites continues to expand understanding of prehistoric human geography. As technology improves and more resources are devoted to underwater archaeology, discoveries of submerged settlements, harbor works, and other structures from periods of lower sea level become more common. Each discovery provides concrete evidence that rising seas did indeed inundate human-inhabited landscapes, and that recovering this lost history is possible through systematic investigation. While these discoveries have not revealed evidence of civilizations as advanced as Churchward's Mu, they demonstrate that humanity's coastal prehistory is literally submerged, and that what we know about ancient human settlement patterns reflects only the portions that remained above water. The question of transoceanic contacts in prehistory also continues to generate new research and discoveries. Genetic studies, chemical analysis of artifacts, and other techniques unavailable to earlier generations of researchers can now definitively establish when and where contacts occurred. The confirmed presence of South American crops in Polynesia before European contact proves that transoceanic voyages occurred. Ongoing research may reveal additional evidence of contact, and perhaps even regular trade routes that conventional history has not recognized. These findings would not validate the Mu hypothesis, but would demonstrate that the prehistoric Pacific was less isolated and more interconnected than once believed. The value of maintaining critical but open-minded perspectives becomes clear when considering the history of how unusual claims have been evaluated. Some ideas that seemed ridiculous when first proposed, continental drift, meteorite impacts, the existence of black holes, eventually gained acceptance as evidence accumulated. Other ideas that seemed initially plausible, phlogiston theory, luminiferous ether, various forms of vitalism, were eventually abandoned as understanding improved. The distinction lies in the evidence and in willingness to revise beliefs when evidence proves them wrong. The scientific method does not claim to possess final truth, but rather offers a process for progressively improving understanding through observation, experimentation, and revision of theories in light of evidence. Applying this perspective to Mu requires acknowledging both what we know and what remains uncertain. We know with high confidence that no continent-sized landmass occupied the central Pacific during human history and sank suddenly 12,000 years ago. The geological mechanisms required for such an event do not exist, and the evidence that should exist if it had occurred is absent. We know that the civilizations of the Pacific Islands developed over thousands of years through processes we can largely reconstruct from archaeological, linguistic, and genetic evidence. We know that transoceanic contacts occurred at some level in prehistory, but that the major patterns of human migration and cultural development can be explained without invoking lost continents. What remains uncertain includes the full details of how Pacific Island cultures developed, the extent and significance of prehistoric transoceanic contacts, the locations and nature of coastal settlements destroyed by rising seas, and the historical basis, if any, of oral traditions about ancestral homelands. These questions remain open to investigation and potentially to revision as new evidence emerges. Maintaining openness to new discoveries while insisting on rigorous standards of evidence provides the best path toward understanding what actually occurred in the deep past. The cultural legacy of Mu and similar lost continent theories extends beyond questions of literal truth to influences on literature, art, popular culture, and collective imagination. The image of a vanished advanced civilization beneath the waves has inspired countless novels, films, and other creative works. It has shaped how many people conceptualize human prehistory and has contributed to broader cultural narratives about lost knowledge, the dangers of hubris, and civilization's fragility. In this sense, Mu exists as a myth, not necessarily as a historical reality, but as a powerful narrative structure that shapes imagination and meaning. Myths serve important functions in human culture even when they are not literally true. They provide frameworks for understanding experience, templates for thinking about complex issues, and vehicles for transmitting values and perspectives across generations. The myth of Mu, whether historically grounded or not, serves as a vessel for anxieties about catastrophe and loss, hopes for recovering lost wisdom, and questions about humanity's place in deep time. It reminds us that the familiar present is contingent, that what seems permanent can disappear, that history contains depths we have not fully explored. These are valuable reminders, regardless of whether a specific continent existed and sank. As you rest now, contemplating these questions of lost lands and forgotten histories, consider what the search for Mu reveals about the human condition. We are creatures who live in the present but are haunted by the past and anxious about the future. We build civilizations knowing they will eventually fall. We accumulate knowledge, knowing much will be lost. We remember selectively, forgetting vast portions of what once seemed important while preserving fragments that may or may not accurately represent what was. Every generation inherits incomplete knowledge from the past and passes incomplete knowledge to the future, participating in a vast intergenerational project of memory and forgetting that spans the entire history of our species. The question of whether Mu was erased from history or simply never existed in the form imagined becomes less important than recognizing that much of humanity's past has indeed been lost, not through conspiracy, but through the ordinary processes of time, decay, and cultural transformation. Most people who have ever lived left no trace in the historical record. Most languages ever spoken have vanished without written record. Most settlements, most works of art, most technologies, most beliefs and practices from our prehistoric past are simply gone, knowable only through fragmentary archaeological remains and genetic signatures that hint at what once was, but can never fully recover it. In this sense, we are all survivors of countless lost worlds, inheritors of fragments from vanished ways of life. The Pacific Ocean itself serves as a powerful metaphor for these themes of depth, mystery, and loss. Covering more than 60 million square miles, containing approximately half of Earth's free water, reaching depths exceeding 6 miles, the Pacific represents the unknown that still exists in our mapped and satellite-imaged world. Much of its floor has never been directly observed by human eyes. Its deepest trenches remain almost as inaccessible as the surface of distant planets. Within its vastness, countless stories played out over tens of thousands of years as humans colonized its islands, developed unique cultures, and adapted to island life in remarkable ways. Some of those stories are preserved in oral tradition, archaeology, and living cultures. Others are irretrievably lost, submerged beneath the waves of time as surely as coastal settlements were submerged beneath the rising seas. Perhaps the most profound truth the Mu legend offers is not about whether a continent sank, but about the relationship between knowing and not knowing, between remembering and forgetting, between the light of historical knowledge and the darkness of prehistory. We stand at a moment in human history where scientific understanding of the past has reached unprecedented sophistication. We can read genetic codes that reveal migration patterns from thousands of years ago. We can date artifacts to specific centuries using multiple independent methods. We can reconstruct ancient climates and environments from ice cores and sediments. Yet for all this knowledge, vast stretches of human experience remain opaque to us, knowable only in outline if at all. This combination of knowledge and ignorance defines the human relationship with deep time. We know enough to understand that we live at the end of a vast story that began with the first humans hundreds of thousands of years ago, that branched and diversified as our ancestors spread across the globe, that has included countless cultures and civilizations that rose and fell, leaving minimal traces. We know enough to reconstruct some of this story in remarkable detail, but we also know how much we do not and cannot know, how much has been irretrievably lost to time. This awareness can be humbling, reminding us of our own contingency and the likely impermanence of what we now take for granted. Let these thoughts settle gently as your consciousness itself settles toward rest. The questions we have explored tonight about lost continents, suppressed history, the transmission and loss of knowledge across generations are questions without final answers, questions that each generation must approach anew with whatever evidence and understanding they possess. We have traced the legend of Mu from its origins in 19th century interpretations of ancient texts through the scattered archaeological mysteries of the Pacific that seem to whisper of connections and origins beyond what conventional history acknowledges, to modern searches employing advanced technology, to considerations of how colonialism and politics shape historical narratives, to ultimate questions about memory, loss, and the human place in deep time. Whether Mu existed matters less, in the end, than what the search for it reveals about who we are and how we understand ourselves. We are meaning-making creatures who construct narratives to explain our origins and situation. We are explorers and questioners who resist simple answers and official narratives when they seem incomplete. We are inheritors of vast stretches of time about which we know frustratingly little. We are builders of civilizations aware of their fragility. We are rememberers of the past even as we forget most of it. We are creatures of the present haunted by vanished worlds and anxious about futures we cannot fully predict or control. The Pacific continues its patient existence, waves rolling across its surface, while the deep remains still and dark, hiding whatever truths lie in its depths. The islands that this vast ocean continue to stand, fragments of volcanic activity, remnants of the Earth's internal fire reaching toward the sun. The peoples who have made these islands home continue their cultures, blending ancient traditions with modern realities, maintaining connections to ancestors while creating new futures. And somewhere in the complex interplay of geology, archaeology, oral tradition, and imagination, the truth about humanity's Pacific prehistory waits to be more fully understood, partially knowable through disciplined investigation, partially forever beyond our reach. Sleep now, or rest in peaceful wakefulness, held by the same earth that has held all your ancestors back through unimaginable stretches of time. The questions remain open, the mysteries persist, and that is as it should be. Complete knowledge would leave no room for wonder, no space for imagination, no motivation for continued exploration and questioning. The uncertainty that frustrates also liberates, keeping possibilities alive and inviting each generation to look again at evidence, to reconsider conclusions, to perhaps discover what previous generations missed. In this ongoing search, in this persistent questioning, In this refusal to accept that everything is already known and understood, we participate in something essentially human, something that connects us across cultures and across time to all the questioners and explorers and dreamers who came before. The legend of Mu, whether truth or fiction, whether historical memory or modern construction, whether suppressed knowledge or never-existing fantasy, has served its purpose tonight by providing a framework for exploring these deeper themes. It has taken us on a journey across the Pacific, through time, into questions of evidence and interpretation, politics and power, memory and forgetting. The journey continues beyond tonight, beyond any single exploration, as part of the eternal human project of understanding where we came from, how we got here, and what it all means. For now, let the questions rest along with your body and mind, trusting that tomorrow or next week or next year, you might return to these mysteries with fresh perspective, new information, or simply the renewed curiosity that makes this seeking itself worthwhile. Rest well in the knowledge that you are part of a story far older and larger than any individual life, a story that includes lost worlds and vanished peoples, remembered and forgotten histories, achievements and catastrophes beyond counting. You carry within you genetic material that has persisted through tens of thousands of generations, through ice ages and migrations, through the rise and fall of countless cultures. You stand at the present moment of that unbroken lineage, inheritor of everything that came before, ancestor of everything that will follow. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.